guess I can share kind of a little background on myself. So I'm the founder of a firm called Centric Solutions. And I think of mapping customers' journeys through a lens of CX strategy. And so thinking through the context of experience design. So how do we ensure that the overall kind of brand promise and overall experience we're seeking to create in terms of driving brand connection gets delivered? And so my view through customer journeys has always been through this lens of customer progress and jobs to be done based research. So people are always seeking to make progress in lives. And progress is all about pursuing goals to accomplish goals and objectives. And so our role as designers of products and services is really oriented around helping people make progress. And many times the product or service is a means to an end. And what we need to understand is the aspirational outcomes, functional outcomes, emotional outcomes that people are seeking to accomplish. So when you view that, through the eyes of customers, customers can be travelers, they can be drivers, they can be homeowners, and that context of who the customer is informs those goals and objectives. So I'm going to be talking about kind of this idea of thinking about journeys through a slightly different context, thinking about them from a behavioral standpoint rather than traditional journey mapping, and thinking about journeys through this idea of progress and understanding what blocks progress and how do we design interventions to enable progress. So I put in the chat a link to what's called the Make It Toolkit and the 15 strategies. I'm a certified instructor of what's called the Make It Toolkit. There are lots of different toolkits in the marketplace as it relates to behavioral design. You may have heard of things like the EAST framework or COMBI, or other methods of applying behavioral science to product and service design. We look at service design through this lens of it's really the intersection of strategy, be it business strategy, CX strategy, design, and behavioral science. And so behavioral design to us is the intersection of those three disciplines as it applies to product design, service design, learning and development, change management. And so one of the things that struck me when I was starting to kind of learn about behavioral design and think about it as related to kind of how I serve my clients and how this discipline might better aid my goals and objectives in working with clients is the Make It Toolkit. It just was much broader and had more depth than many of the products that I was looking at. So the Make It Toolkit is informed by a gentleman by the name of Massimo Ingenio. He's an instructor for a behavioral design school in Thailand. And what he's done is he basically brought together all these distinct disciplines, from persuasion science to nudging strategies to loyalty strategies to incentive science, and integrated them into a toolkit called the Make It Toolkit. What I find unique to this particular toolkit is that it enables us to think through behavioral design strategies, both bottoms up through tactics, as well as top down through strategies. And I think that's very powerful when we're thinking through how do we influence or change customer experiences as it relates to their particular journeys. So I'm going to be talking about this new field or discipline of thinking about journeys from a behavioral standpoint, and how I leverage the Make It Toolkit to facilitate that. So when you think about humans as a whole and behavioral change, whether at the individual level or at the organization level, we all have great intentions in terms of what we seek to accomplish, right? But we don't always necessarily achieve the outcomes we're seeking to accomplish. And so we call that gap, right, of our intentions not being realized as this abyss of struckness, right? And so this whole idea of behavioral design is to understand what are the blockers, right? What is preventing individuals, teams, organizations from achieving the outcomes they seek to accomplish. We do that by leveraging the Make It Toolkit in this discipline called Applied Behavioral Science, and what we're going to dive into in terms of behavioral journey mapping. So the Make It Toolkit is a toolkit, right? And so toolkits need to be integrated into some structure or some process. And so when we sought to think about how do we enable people to take this toolkit and leverage it in day-to-day business operations, the design sprint stood out to us. One is being quite popular across the industry, and something that could provide the platform for integrating this discipline. Who all is familiar with the design sprint process? To what degree do you use it in your organization? Maybe put in the chat or raise your hand in terms of whether the design sprint process is something you leverage in your day-to-day operations or work. So a few, Paul, anyone else? All right. Yeah, so there's many versions of the design sprint process. So what we like about the design sprint process, first and foremost, is it distinguishes problem space from solution space, right? And so when you think through a design lens, it's super important to define the problem before you go off and try to solve it. Secondly, it provides the structure of both, defining your goals and objectives, defining the context for what you're trying to improve, determining the individuals you're trying to solve this for, mapping out the process, identifying the process, ideating in terms of ways to solve for new experiences, prototyping and testing them. But when you step back and think about the sprint process of itself, other than the fact that we prototype and build and put that in front of customers and get feedback from customers, inherently, it's not a human-centered design process, right? There's nothing specific to the tasks or activities that make it human-centered. So our goal and objective in terms of integrating the Make It Toolkit into the design sprint was to make it a more human-centered process by design. And so we've taken kind of the platform of the design sprint, and we've integrated a set of different distinct activities at each stage of the design sprint to infuse a more human-centered process around it. So here's how we view the behavioral, what we call the behavioral design sprint. From preparation and strategizing to mapping and understanding, to brainstorming and visualizing, to prototyping and building, to testing and validating. And one of the core aspects of this is, from a standpoint of preparing and strategizing, is that we start with a behavioral challenge statement, right? We have a set of goals or business outcomes that we're seeking to achieve, but we define and formulate a behavioral challenge statement to set the context for what we're seeking to influence or change in terms of a particular targeted audience or set of personas. Those could be behaviors we're trying to encourage. Those could be behaviors we're trying to discourage. And so that context then frames the who we're trying to solve for. We're going to be focusing on today this mapping and understand phase. And so what we're going to be highlighting is this process of doing behavioral journey mapping as the mapping activity that we do in a behavioral design sprint prior to our ideation, our prototyping, our build phases, and so forth. The goal of this mapping activity is going to be to identify specific intervention points to apply behavioral strategies and tactics to influence the overall journey. I teach a class. We have a new cohort coming up in August around the entire process, start to finish, from formulating behavioral challenge statements to mapping and understanding to ideating using the Make It strategies and tactics, to prototyping and building using many of the Gen AI tools that are on the market for visualizing and storyboarding and building out initial prototypes and concepts. I'll share some more information about the course at the end of the presentation, but our focus for today is really going to be on this mapping side of things and formulating what we would call a behavioral design hypothesis. And so one of the things that we seek to do in terms of behavioral design sprint is to define specifically what the prototypes we're building are to support. What kind of behavioral change are we seeking to guide or direct through prototyping new solutions and concepts? So I wanted to give a kind of a quick context in terms of how I would distinguish or define traditional journey mapping from behavioral journey mapping. I'm speaking obviously to an audience very engrossed in this whole idea of customer journey management. You're a more advanced group in terms of kind of the distinction and of each of these. When I think of customer journey mapping, oftentimes traditional journey mapping is really focused and centered around kind of identifying touch points and interactions, right? And so one distinction of behavioral journey mapping is this idea of understanding the psychological aspects of user behavior. And so what you're going to see when we start to lay out a journey, we start to frame it in terms of a sequence of user behaviors that we're seeking to influence or change. Another is from kind of this context of a design objective. And so oftentimes from a journey management standpoint, we're looking to optimize customer experience, right? We're looking to identify friction points. We're looking to improve the experience at different points. We're looking to improve customer satisfaction, overall NPS of the journey, and so forth. When we think about behavioral journey mapping, our context is actually to influence or change user behavior, right? And so we're literally evaluating the behaviors in terms of understanding what barriers are preventing people from making progress and how do we influence or change that process. Traditional customer journey mapping has always had this focus in terms of understanding kind of the emotional journey alongside the interactions and touch points, right? And so we're looking to understand the degree to which there are positive or negative emotions, whether there's fear, whether there's anxiety, whether there's doubt, and so forth. And so we tend to map kind of the highs and lows of journeys from an emotional standpoint. From a behavioral journey mapping standpoint, we're literally looking to understand and shape that behavior. And so we're looking for design interventions that may change the intended or may drive the intended consequences along the journey, as well as influence future behaviors. When you think about kind of this process or outcome orientation, traditional journey management is often very process and structured oriented, right? In terms of defining the process, measuring the process, giving feedback around the process for other teams who are doing the actual product design or service design and so forth. From a behavioral journey mapping standpoint, we're literally using this as a tool for design and change management. So we're literally defining the interventions to occur. We're literally strategizing on how to make those changes or bring them to life. So one thing that's foundational to the Make It Toolkit are these 5 laws of behavior, all influenced by various thought leaders. We're going to kind of highlight at least 2 of these behavioral laws as part of how we go about journey mapping. So the first law, behavior is always a function of the person and the environment. You all know that from the standpoint of thinking through journeys, right? You tend to do them through the lens of a targeted audience or a persona. Potentially, you also include an environmental context. So it's not only who is performing the journey, but in what environmental context is it performed. Second, that behavior is influenced by this interplay of system 1 and system 2 thinking, right? So we have kind of our fast side of the brain and our slow side of the brain. And so one of the things we seek to understand is what kind of decision making are we driving people to do or perform across different stages of the journey. Third is this law that every behavior is prompted by an activator and influenced by the consequences associated with the behavior. And so we'll be looking at behavioral journey mapping through this lens of the ABC law. Fourth, that behavior tends to follow the status quo unless it is acted upon by an increase in motivation or ability and prompt or timely prompted. And so we'll be looking at how do you evaluate different barriers to progress related to motivation, ability, or the particular cue or prompt we leverage. And then finally, we'll be looking at behavior through the lens of motivation, recognizing for certain behaviors to occur, different types of motivation are required. And that motivation is on a spectrum. Motivation occurs from an intrinsic standpoint to an extrinsic standpoint in terms of particular behaviors. So the toolkit itself has these 5 laws at its foundation, but you can think about it as kind of these 3 different buckets of strategies or tactics that we leverage. We're going to be focusing on what I call these barriers to progress as it relates to the problem space of thinking through design, which is on identifying and defining what's preventing people from making progress. Are those barriers related to motivation? Are they related to ability? Or are they related to the effectiveness of the prompts we're using? When you transition into the solution space, that's where the make it strategies and tactics come into play. And that based upon the design interventions we've identified, we can leverage these different strategies and tactics to influence or change behavior as part of the overall journey. So we're going to walk through basically these 5 core components, these 5 steps, or what you'll see are kind of just layers of the journey, right? And so when we build out our journey map, you'll see that there are these different layers that we begin to build out. One foundational to behavioral journey mapping is literally just defining the behavior, defining the sequence of behaviors and what does the user do. Secondly, is understanding the prompts associated with the behavior. And so one of the laws that you'll learn is that all behavior is prompted, right? And so it's important for us to understand what context exists at any given step in the journey, and to what degree are the right internal or external triggers in place to cue that behavior. Third is that we study the consequences. So depending upon whether a behavior occurs or doesn't occur, there can be positive or negative consequences associated with each behavioral step. Fourth, what barriers are in place that prevent people from making the right decision or making progress along the journey. And then fifth, these opportunity points. So these intervention strategies. So we're going to kind of take a little bit of a case study and kind of walk through these 5 different components and how we go about defining them. To do that, the framework we're going to use is, the technical term for this framework is the trans-theoretical model. The context we're going to use is we're going to look at this journey through the lens of the stages of behavior change. Okay? This is particularly a really good framework to leverage within the context of behavioral change that requires some individual change or motivation to perform the behavior. Super great in a healthcare context, super great in terms of health or wellness. There are many different frameworks you can use in terms of how you think about journeys. But for the purpose of our case study today, we're going to leverage this framework. So the stages of this journey we're going to define as kind of pre-contemplation, right? So the stage of the journey where the individual is not yet aware that change is needed, and or they have no intention to change in the foreseeable future. Second stage is this contemplation stage. So they're becoming problem aware, they're considering the change, somewhat ambivalent to the change at this point in time. Preparation, that they've decided that some type of personal change is necessary. They're starting to plan how to do it. They're potentially taking some small steps. Action, they're actively changing the behavior, they're implementing the plan. Maintenance stage, the individual has sustained the new behavior for some period of time. We're seeking to help them prevent relapse to old habits or old behaviors. Termination is this idea that they've sustained the behavior change for a while, right? It's working well. It's part of their routine. It's become a habit. And then the stage of reverting to old habits, right? So returning to the old behavior, often due to stress, lack of support, loss of motivation. So as you kind of a stopping point right now. So when you think of kind of this behavioral change, what would be context where you think this is applicable to your own life in terms of things you've had great intentions around, right, but potentially haven't achieved? Either in the chat or just open it up to conversation. Can you relate to this from a standpoint of a health routine, or parenting, or quitting smoking, or what other context? All right, changing financial decisions to change more. Great example. This is a really good framework for the standpoint of things like saving for retirement or stuff like that, right? You have great intention, you just haven't taken the initial action. Other type of personal experiences that you see this relative to.
Okay, I have to, like, as mom of teenagers, to make them clean their room. I think I can use that framework and on a business case.
Yes.
I have a challenge now.
Yeah, you're trying to get them into that action phase, right?
Yeah. In another case, I have business challenge because one of part of our customers, they don't use using digital platform. They more used using manual WhatsApp chat as an ordering channel. Yeah. So here my challenge is to change their behavior, to offer them something like hybrid model, you know? Yeah. So thank you for that. Looking forward on something else.
Yeah, great example. So you can see there's an inherent behavioral context to this in terms of the stages of change. All right, so that's going to be the framework. So that's the first component, is just simply understanding the behavior. So if you may not have heard of this book. If you haven't, highly recommend it. Great book. One of the concepts in this book that Matt Waller presents is this idea of starting at the end, right? And so this is critical to behavioral science, right? In terms of if we're trying to drive behavioral change, right, it's critical to understand the target behavior we're seeking to drive, right? Those target behaviors should align with business or business model outcomes, but it's critical to identify what's the endpoint, what is the end behavior we're trying to drive. And so when we start to frame a journey through a behavioral lens, rather than go left to right, we actually go right to left, right? So we start by defining the endpoint, right? And so in this case, for the context of our case study, which is centered around kind of a rheumatoid arthritis patient, the endpoint, right, is to get this individual or groups of people to a stage where they're committed to long-term self-care, right? So the behaviors that best support them treating their particular diagnosis are in place. They have routine around them. They have a habit around those set of activities. And then we work our way back to understand the starting point to the end point. And so we've framed this in terms of our behavioral change model from pre-contemplation stage to contemplation stage to preparation stage to action phase or maintenance. And so in our case, this is in relation to recognizing the need for treatment, learning about treatment options, scheduling initial medical consultation, attending that consultation, and committing to long-term care. And so that's what we would define as the sequence of behaviors we're seeking to influence or change to help people make progress towards an end goal or objective of dealing with their diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. Okay. The whole intent of going through this behavioral journey mapping process is to identify specific design interventions, right? And so if we find that there's a population of people that can't transition from pre-contemplation to contemplation, understanding what design interventions we can bring to bear to help them make progress from stage to stage to stage of the journey. All right, so you're going to get kind of the real practical application of these laws, right? And so the third law is this idea that every behavior is prompted by an activator and influenced by consequences associated with it. So one of the things we're going to be layering into our journey is this idea of prompts, right? No behavior occurs without a prompt, whether that prompt is an internal prompt or an external prompt. So external prompts you can think about as like cues from the environment or the people around us, right, as being facilitating or triggering the behaviors to occur. Internal prompts have more to do with the individuals themselves, right? So these are our thoughts, our feelings, it can be bodily sensations and so forth. So when you start to think about the context of this behavioral journey, we're trying to identify to what degree are the right external prompts in place to facilitate or cue or trigger this behavior. So these can be environmental cues, right? So this can be signage or directions or things of that nature. They can be technological cues, right? Examples being like notifications on a phone or reminders. They can be social cues. They can be media cues, right? So much of our advertising, right, is used to prompt or cue behaviors in consumers. Or they could be social cues from family members or colleagues and so forth. And so when we're thinking about the external prompts associated with the sequence of behaviors, we're trying to identify, are the right external prompts in place? Are the right prompts, are these prompts effective? Are they timely? Or are we missing prompts that we potentially need to design? Internal prompts, right? So these are due to things like bodily sensation, emotions, thoughts, desires, physical sensations, and so forth. More often than not, many of our behaviors are actually triggered through internal prompts. And oftentimes the goal of the external prompt is to trigger the internal prompt to then trigger the behavior, right? Much of our advertising is centered around driving specific motivations or emotions in consumers to then prompt the associated behavior. So we're using the external prompt to trigger the internal prompt to trigger the behavior. So this is probably a newer concept, right? So oftentimes when we think of journeys, like we don't really think of internal prompts, right? We think of touch points and interactions. We think much more about the external prompts than we do about the internal prompts. And yet from a behavioral standpoint, oftentimes the internal prompts are more critical than the external prompts. Any questions around this concept? All right. So we've got our framing of the journey behaviorally. And so when we're doing behavioral journey mapping, we're literally mapping out what we believe the external prompts to be in relation to the journey we're trying to influence or change. So as we mentioned, these can be observations, right? So potentially the reason someone recognizes the need for treatment is that a friend or a colleague or a family member, right, observes a particular behavior and recommends that they, or notices that they have the symptoms and encourages them to seek new information. It could be reminders or emails or ads, right? It could be alerts from a health app or a phone or whatever to remind people to take their medication. So we're laying kind of the landscape of what are the necessary external prompts to help facilitate or trigger this behavior. We're also studying the internal prompts, right? So these can be things like a desire for relief. These could be things like anticipation of diagnosis. And so these internal prompts are the things that more often than not are really the true drivers to whether the behavior occurs. And so we need to understand those and determine to what degree can we influence or ensure that these prompts are in place to trigger the desired behaviors of the individuals we're trying to influence. All right, the next layer of our journey mapping is this idea of consequences, right? So consequences are very powerful, right? The degree to which the behavior occurs, to the degree to which it's avoided, repeated, continues over time, is oftentimes related to the consequences of behavior, right? So whether a behavior occurs or doesn't occur, there can either be positive or negative consequences. And so when we start to think about design interventions, right, we talked about this notion of sometimes we're trying to increase certain behaviors, sometimes we're trying to decrease certain behaviors. And so our intervention strategies might be oriented around adding desired outcomes, desirable outcomes alongside the journey, removing something that's unpleasant, adding something undesirable, taking away something that's desirable. So these become different strategies, either positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment for influencing or changing behavior. So similar to how we would map the external and internal prompts, we map what we view to be positive or negative consequences associated with the behavior. So this often is coming through observation, through customer research, through customer interviews. So many of the things you guys do in relation to studying journeys, but potentially a different lens than you've used in the past, in terms of we're literally categorizing the degree to which certain positive or negative consequences have been observed. When you do what I call a behavioral audit, oftentimes you can audit the journey and make observations in terms of behavioral science assumptions. And so one of the things I really like about the They Do product is this ability to capture insights and have statuses of insights. And so what you've noticed in terms of how I've used They Do in this context is in certain cases, I've simply logged a BSI assumption, right? Of that there's high probability or likelihood that this type of negative or positive consequence can occur at different stages of the journey. And then as I process my voice of the customer data, as I process my interviews, I'm able to then associate or identify conversations with customers that map to particular positive or negative consequences, right? And so in this case, right, there's a negative consequence of anxiety or fear. That's a BSI assumption in terms of, right, oftentimes people, right, there's anxiety and fear about even dealing with these types of issues. And so one of the customer interviews we held identified, right, this context of I dropped a cup of coffee at home because my grip gave out, right? My wife set up an appointment before I had a say in it. After reading enough horror stories, I panicked and booked a general's doctor appointment. I needed to know for sure, right? So that's kind of this idea of reassurance being kind of a positive outcome of taking a particular behavioral step. And so what we're doing is basically kind of integrating both our voice of the customer data with our behavioral science assumptions in terms of the types of positive or negative consequences we need to be aware of at any stage. Any questions around this idea of consequences? Does anyone do this kind of analysis in relation to your journey mapping? Chime in. Not yet, but like the idea. All right. Yeah, so a different lens. So a behavioral lens, right, to kind of these stages of the journey. What William said, to a small degree. Okay. All right. The next layer of the journey we're going to talk about is the fourth law. And so this idea of behavior, right, is this rule or law of that behavior tends to follow the status quo unless it is acted upon by an increase in motivation or ability or is timely prompted. And so what we're trying to identify now is, well, what are the obstacles? What's preventing people from making progress along the journey? So this fourth law is built upon the work of B.J. Fogg, who's a professor at Stanford. And he has this Fogg behavioral model, which is this idea that for any behavior to occur, rule number one, a person has to be prompted, right? There has to be an internal or external prompt that triggers or cues the behavior to occur. The second is that a person needs to be motivated to overcome the effort required to do the behavior. And the third is that a person needs to be able to do the behavior. Okay. And now ability, you see here, it's kind of easy to do to hard to do, but think of ability multidimensionally. So ability can be related to having enough time to do it, having the right requisite knowledge to perform it, having the right level of ability can relate to cognitive effort and so forth. And so it can relate to money, right? So there are multiple dimensions in terms of, do people have the ability to perform the behavior? And so what's useful about this framework is that we can look at any behavior and we begin to determine where it falls in terms of, is it above this action line where the prompt succeeds, or is it below this action line where the prompt fails? So Sometimes we have high motivation around performing specific activities or changes, but we have low ability, right? And so in those instances, no matter how often we're prompted, right, unless we address the ability, the ability barriers, the behavior won't occur, right? A simple example, someone might be motivated to improve their health, to take on an exercise routine and so forth. But at this point in time, they may be caring for an elderly father or mother. And so despite their motivation, right, to add a workout routine, to start that activity or exercise, they simply don't have the time, right? And so as much as we try to cue or prompt them and so forth, unless they have the ability to do it, right, they're never going to perform the behavior. We can have certain behaviors where people have the ability to perform them, but they simply just don't have the motivation. And or we can have particular user behaviors where there's the right level of motivation, there's the right level of ability, such that if it's timely prompted or cued, that the behavior occurs. All right, so a simple framework, but very useful in starting to think about to what degree are there specific barriers to progress related to motivation, ability, or attention. So in the Make It Toolkit, we have a database of these 45 plus behavioral barriers to progress relating to motivation, ability, or prompted. And you can see an example of some of these, right? So they can be sunk cost fallacy. They can simply be the lack of a prompt, right? They can be old habits that are tough to overcome, decision fatigue, lack of progress, and so forth. And so what we're looking to do through behavioral audits or behavioral analysis is identify which of these barriers might be present in the context of the particular types of user journeys that we're studying. And so similar to how we map out prompts and consequences, we're literally mapping out to what degree are there specific barriers to progress at any given stage of the journey. Recognizing that in order for us to improve the overall experience, to help people make progress, we may need design interventions to address these specific barriers. So someone might have a personal belief, right? So a perception or understanding that the cost or effort to do something may not be worthwhile, right? And that barrier may be what's preventing them from getting out of this pre-contemplation stage to this contemplation stage. And so some type of intervention, right, needs to be considered in terms of how do we get people to address this barrier to progress in some type of way, through our marketing, through our communications, through a consultation, and so forth. At a later stage of the journey, they might have fear of failure, right? This anxiety about discovering this serious condition or facing the diagnosis. They may lack the requisite social support to make progress along their journey and so forth. And so in this fashion, the same thing, we're basically identifying potential barriers to progress related to motivation, ability, or prompt to set the context for if we are to design interventions, where will those interventions exist to drive different behaviors or patterns. All right. So the intent of point of kind of doing this behavioral journey mapping at the end of the day is to really determine opportunity points, right? Is to determine like where might design interventions from a behavioral science standpoint, right, be purposeful in terms of facilitating or helping people take action or make progress, right? To change their perception, to influence their behaviors, to drive more positive outcomes, and so forth. And so we've laid out the context for this, right? We've identified the associated prompts. We've mapped out the sequence of user behaviors. We've identified our positive and negative consequences. And so the exercise of identifying opportunity points through this lens of ABC is identifying where might these behavioral interventions occur, right? And so there are 3 layers where we can intervene. We can intervene at what we call the antecedent intervention level, right? And so this involves setting up, new cues or prompts to activate the desired behavior. This involves assessing the degree to which the prompts in place are effective or not. This can be to the level of, if we have low open rates on emails, right, what might we change about the subject line, right, to motivate or drive behavior? If people aren't taking action on the email, what might we change in terms of the content of the email to either make it easier to consume, easier to understand, to drive more click rate or follow through, and so forth? So this is where the touch points come into play, right? But now we have a behavioral context for evaluating and understanding each touch point and the effectiveness of the touch points in associating with the barriers to progress. We can intervene at the behavioral level itself, right? So this can be in relation to the person or the environment, or specific design interventions to help you or people overcome the identified barriers to progress. Or we can intervene at the consequential level, right? So identifying ways to modify the consequences, right? That's back to that, ensuring that the positive outcomes occur, helping people avoid negative consequences in terms of our strategies, in terms of intervention. Once we know the intervention opportunities, this is kind of where the Make It Toolkit shines, right? And so now that we know the different points of intervention, we can identify the particular strategies and tactics to leverage to best influence or change or make progress in relation to the journey. This is the essence of the course that we teach, is this idea of going from behavioral challenge statement to mapping the behaviors, to defining the interventions, to then ideating using these strategies and tactics, to then conceptualizing new solutions, to then prototyping and building them within the context of a behavioral design sprint. So when we design these interventions, one of the things we like to make sure is in place is this concept of a behavioral design hypothesis, right? And so this is our analysis of these different design interventions and how we would frame them. And so the formula we like to use is this context of, if we do this, our design treatment among this user segment, the targeted user, then this will happen, an expected outcome because of this reason. We applied this make it strategy and this make it tactic as a way of intervening at that point in the journey. An example would be, and this is kind of in our maintenance stage, if we do this, build ongoing social accountability and ritualized check-ins among this user segment, patients who are trying to maintain their new behavior, then this will happen. We'll have better sustained progress and reduce risk of relapse because of this reason, social reinforcement and symbolic rewards. Applying the strategies of make it social, make it meaningful, make it yours. These behavioral design hypotheses then inform the context for what we're prototyping and building and testing, right? They're the mechanism for how we measure the degree to which the solutions we put in place are effective, right? Do they drive these type of changes? Do we Do we have to rethink the strategies or tactics? Are we getting the measured outcomes that we're trying to achieve? All right. So we spoke to two of the five behavioral laws. In the course, we kind of go through all five laws, but just to give you a little context. So I'm sure many of you, in terms of using the They Do platform, you probably just don't have one generic journey. You probably have started to think through journeys as it relates to different targeted personas or segments of your customer base and so forth. And so similar, when you do behavioral journey analysis, you can do it from a generic standpoint, but you can also evaluate, right, prompts, consequences, behaviors specific to given targeted personas, because they will be different. Second is this law of systems one and systems two thinking. One of the things we go into the course is what we call task analysis. And so when we think of user behaviors and the task we're asking them to perform, there are different types of tasks. There are simple tasks, there are complex tasks, there are planning tasks, there are help-seeking tasks, there are research tasks, there are analysis tasks. So all tasks, right, require different levels of effort, different levels of cognitive processing, different levels of motivation. So task analysis is a great way of kind of identifying kind of the context of what we're asking people to perform and identifying, are there potentially specific design interventions that make more or less sense given the context of the tasks they're asked to perform. And then third, we talked about motivation within the context of the BJ Fogg model. And so it's not only is the right motivation in place, but where on the spectrum, right? For this particular task, is it going to require more intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation, right? And so how do we ensure the right motivation is in place to drive or inform the behavior? All right, so that's kind of the talk in terms of this idea of doing behavioral journey mapping. We'll open it up to some questions, but I wanted to give you a little bit of information in terms of if you wanted to learn more, definitely reach out and connect on LinkedIn. I have a bi-weekly newsletter where I talk about the Make It Toolkit and the different laws of behavior. Strategies. You can find my website, Customer Centric LLC. And then there's, if you want to learn more about the Make It Toolkit, there's a starter program, kind of a 30-day kind of go at your own pace, kind of learn about behavioral science. You learn about the 5 laws, learn about the 15 strategies, start to think about how it might apply to your own work. So I'll put a link to that in the chat. And then we have a upcoming course where we're teaching the entire behavioral design sprint process from challenge statement to prototyping concepts, introducing the Make It Toolkit and how to leverage it in terms of your own practical examples. I'll put a link to that. And so for anyone who's on the call today, we're offering a $150 discount for anyone who's interested in learning more and taking that course. And so that link will take you to a rather detailed syllabus in terms of the course content. So I'll kind of go back to here. This is probably the big overview slide, and then we can kind of take questions.
Yeah, thank you, John, for sharing. Super interesting and valuable topic. And yeah, we still have a few minutes left to address some questions. I see Erin is asking, can you explain your process for assessing priority if there are multiple barriers?
Yeah, I like to use the RICE model. People familiar with RICE prioritization? So RICE stands for reach, impact, confidence, and effort. And I think it's probably the best prioritization method out there in terms of thinking through the prioritization of intervention strategies. So the formula is reach times impact times confidence is on the top part of the equation, divided by effort to come up with a RICE score. I think it's probably one of the more effective methods of doing kind of prioritization of intervention strategies. What I like is that impact times confidence. It weights things, right? So sometimes we think there's that there could be significant impact if we implemented this change, but we have very little evidence for it, right? In other cases, it might be moderate impact, but we have high confidence, right, that the change will occur. So that multiplier kind of tends to come up with a great weighted average for those kind of things. And then reach, obviously, how many people would this change affect or influence, or would it affect if we did it? All right, can you talk about identifying internal prompts from users when you're talking them recall from memory? So I do, part of the work I do is around customer jobs to be done research. And I think the essence of getting to those is you really have to probe, right? And so when you're conducting customer interviews, so one, it has to be recent, right? So if you're interviewing people and you're talking about things that might have occurred a year ago, right? It might be difficult for them to recall, like, what was the prompt in the moment and so forth. But if the experience is relatively recent, right? It's been in the last 3 months or so, potentially even up to 6 months. If you probe or prompt in relation to, so what were you thinking at that time? Oftentimes people are able to recall kind of what was the underlying motivation, right? I know from personal experience, right? Certain events occur, right? You have an uncle, right, who has a particular health condition, and you're talking, and you realize, oh, if only Uncle Carlos, right, had done something about this, right? And so those emotions of the moment, right, become your own cues to, well, I need to really take more thought to kind of working on my health, to eating right, and so forth. We can definitely trigger those memories through conversations and moments. Does that answer your question, William? Yeah, it definitely requires it's not a surface level interview. It's definitely a probing type interview. Who were you with? What were you thinking? Right? Why did you? I study kind of customer progress, and I study hiring moments, right? And you're studying, well, like, why did you decide on Monday, December 12th to do this? Like, why that day? You've been thinking about doing this for 2 years. Like, why did you do it on that day? You really have to probe.